Okay, so this is Mrs. Bryant's house, and that's where they put you. I want to back up though, because the brown house where they took the picture of you with when you were naked with the rose trellis wrapped around you and you were 3 years old. I have always believed Ruth had that picture in her picture box under her bed when I was a kid. I remember seeing it.
She did.
And I have thought ever since the flashbacks that they used that as a calling card for when Ralph had was it Chalk had the taxi cab company?
Ralph and Brother.
Ralph and Brother had the taxi cab
Sylvester.
company. And I think that's how they sent some business to Miss Bryant.
Yeah, it was.
And then when you were first raped, when you first came here, when you were 3 years old, and they put you on the porch with the sunglasses.
I was 5. When I was 3, she wouldn't take me. She said I had to be 5. She didn't take kids until they were 5. And the first day I was there, and I went with Ruth when she had that conversation. And the first day that I was there, the first window was a door, and the porch came all the way across, and there were 2 steps going up to it. And the prostitute was leaving, and she had 2 black eyes. She'd been beaten up. And the other door is the door to the living room where we went in and out, and the patrons went in and out. And then the next,
and I think I want to back up too, because I think when they made you sit on the porch with your black eyes and the sunglasses when you couldn't walk after this assault, I think that she used that as a calling card too, to say that she had a new girl, fresh meat.
She might have.
Because then this house across the intersection, this great big giant house, let me zoom in, was a Chinese food place when I was in high school. But tell me about that house.
That was a rooming house for railroaders who didn't actually live in Clovis, but they would get like if they lived in Vaughn or they lived in Berlin, they would get a trip, and they would have to spend the night in Clovis, and so that was where a lot of them stayed. Real handy to Miss Bryant's house.
Right.
And
I think that when they had you sitting on the porch over here, because that was just directly across the intersection in one street. So
and
there.
That house was white, and I had a nursery at Twin Oaks where my great-grandmother lived, and I thought that was her house because it was a big white house. And I threatened them that I was going to go over there and tell her what they were doing to me. And they called Ruth up here, and Arnold didn't live here. I just lived here by myself. And we would come here after school, and then Ruth would pick him up after I went to bed, and then she'd bring him back in the morning, so he wasn't around. And I remember hearing Miss Bryant say, James Arnold cannot be here, because she knew he'd be trouble. And anyway, right behind the house is a cellar where they kept the booze.
We're going to go around to the alley.
And just behind that was a little rent house where Melsine and Ray lived. And Ray was another person that drove traffic here. And he was also a cab driver.
And that was Ray Tipton. And he would have been a cab driver with Ralph and Brother, who distributed the photo as a calling card.
Exactly.
Okay, now this brown house, who is this?
That was, that girl, I can't remember, but she wound up working after the divorce from, gosh, I can't think of her name, but it was her and 3 sisters and a single mom that lived there, and they couldn't play with me. I was off limits. And Thelma Rector was her name, and she married.
And was Thelma your age?
No, she was Grady and Chalk's age.
Okay.
And she married Gene Eccles, and then she divorced him after she had a child with him, a daughter, and then she moved to Lubbock, and she was working for the department store there, Dillard's, in the cosmetic department, and she was telling me that I should come there and work.
And that was after the divorce.
That was after the divorce. And I said, I have a house really close to this, but I'm sure they couldn't pay me enough to make my payments. And she said, it's a really good place to work. You really ought to come here and work. But she was always really sweet to me. And
did you know any of the people that lived across the street over here?
Isn't that weird? I didn't know that.
It's not
I
really
only knew
weird.
that was a rooming house for
For the railroaders, so that's
Yeah.
that house.
And and we used to walk to is it still on?
Yeah.
The State Lyceum and the State Theater and the Lyceum Theater. Every Friday night we would walk over there with Mrs. Bryant to see Roy Rogers, Dale Evans, Gene.
And that's just a couple of blocks over to the right on Main Street,
Yeah.
and then down on Fifth, so
Couple
like
more
4
blocks.
blocks.
Yeah.
And you
And-
didn't know this big white house in the corner. You didn't know who lived there.
No, I don't remember.
That's a curiosity to me because
It's still in good shape.
it's still in good shape, which makes me think that somebody has had it for generations, and also because of this rock fence back here that is so similar to the fence at Hillcrest Park. But it seems to me like it would be somebody with money.
It could have been a railroader. Leonard built a fence just like that in the back of South Lee, and the rocks came from the rock quarry out here. We wouldn't pick them up.
Oh,
when we were
okay.
kids.
Well, I also wondered because I know you told me the courthouse is straight ahead,
Yeah.
and it's always been there. You can kind of see it over the trees. It faces Main Street.
Mhm.
And then you on this next street, you said there were a bunch of lawyers. Do you want me to go down the alley next?
If you can.
Yeah. We're gonna try it. Okay, so this is the alley behind 717 Conley, which was where Mrs. Bryant lived. Do you know anything about this house? Okay.
We were never over here. I wasn't.
Okay.
Arnold probably could tell you.
So her alley would have
Okay.
been.
Stop her.
Is that hers? Oh, that's hers.
That's
Okay.
hers.
So that's her
Oh,
alley.
let's
That's
see
the
if
house.
that,
Hang on. Let me call it.
cellar is still there.
I'm sure it is. It's all weeds. There, you couldn't see through there. It's all weeds.
See that little house? That's where Zing and Ray live. See that little teeny house in the back? Right
Yeah.
there. See the roof?
Yep.
Okay, and between that and her house is where the cellar is. And then she had a garden behind the garage out here. And we used to go sit in that garden and eat yellow tomatoes. They were so good.
So
And then Johnny Carroll and Arnold would come out here and throw rocks. It's a preacher's kids. And
did she have an upstairs in that house? Because there's an attic window up there.
not that I know of. There could have been one up there. I don't
I
know.
wonder if I can get in the camera. Trees in the way. Hang on.
That's one of those old Sears houses.
Hang on.
Yep, there's a window up there. Yep, you probably was. I didn't know about that.
I wonder if she had, yeah,
A
see,
prostitute
you
up
can-
there?
Yeah, I do
Probably.
wonder that because she trafficked.
I know that
There it
night
is.
that we came home and they were having a raid, the porch was full of really fancy whiskey bottles and rum bottles, all the heavy liquor bottles. And she was just running for her life, screaming, "It's a raid, it's a raid, it's a raid, they've raided us." And Mr. Bryant was,
And that was when you came home from the theater one afternoon.
one night.
Oh, no.
And Mr. Bryant was arrested all the time. He was forever over in the jail.
Well, we found a lot on him in the newspaper archives when we
Yeah.
ordered microfilm.
And there
in
used to
90s.
be a little storage building right here. And that's where the radio came on and said, we've had an escaped prisoner. Everybody lock your doors and go check your outbuildings because he's somewhere. And I said, oh, he's in the storage building. And I took off, they called it the shack. And I went just flying outside, and it was on Sunday when her whole family was there having Sunday dinner. And the guy started chasing me saying that her kids, her sons, and they would chase me saying, Bonnie, wait. And I said, he's there, he's in that building. And we went and looked in the door, and they said, Bonnie, where? And I said, he's under the tablecloth, the oilcloth. Pick it up. And he was there.
And so you had developed psychic ability.
Yeah, that
at
was my
time,
first psychic.
which is very common among kids who were sexually assaulted at that age, because to deal with the pain and trauma of the physical assault, you go out of your body,
Mhm.
like when you die.
Yep.
Okay, so Oh, that's where the boys lived.
Uh-huh. That's where the boys lived. And then Jamie Nessel lived, not in the next house, but the next house over. And I didn't know her at that time, but when
I don't know what I'm running over there.
I assumed
It looks like a piece of a curb. I'm gonna back up.
when I was in high school, her and her mom still lived there. And I think she was a single mom, and I think they had a pretty rough time. There's a bridge. I'm gonna put that back here.
Okay. So these
But
houses were the attorneys. Is
They
that
were,
right?
yeah. Mrs. Hartley and her husband lived in one. Dr. Protho lived in one.
Okay, now, Mrs. Hartley was always the wealthy woman in town, and the interesting thing to me about her is that when I was in high school here, she was still always the wealthy woman in town, but she had 2 attorney sons,
And husband.
and she donated a ton of money in this town, or at least had the persona of being charitable towards single moms and battered women.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know if I believe the bullshit, because it could have been a cover for trafficking.
It could have been.
Her husband was he a politician?
Her husband was an attorney, and then he divorced her when I was right after high school, and he was the attorney general,
Yeah.
and he married some young.
And that would have been like in
woman.
1959. That's when you
Or 60,
graduated.
yeah.
So that's when he was attorney general.
That's when he ran for attorney general and won.
And she's still, I think, over there by the courthouse, or at least a few years ago, still had it. She's dead, but had some battered women's organization. I've always wondered if it was a cover for trafficking. I know she was well respected, but I sure don't know if I buy the bullshit. Do you know who any of these people were in these houses?
I don't know. I know that they were all doctors and lawyers, and I don't know who lived. I don't know which ones they lived in, but I know that the Hartleys lived. I think that might have been the preacher from that had the 5 boys. That was the First Baptist preacher. What did I tell you his name was? I can't remember.
I don't know. I don't.
I remembered the other day and told you, but I can't think right now. But anyway, I think that's where he lived. I think that belonged to the church. And then, then next door,
Okay, now I just want to get a clear view here, because this is the courthouse here, and then here's more. There's the jail, and then on the other side of this, on Main Street somewhere, was where Miss Hartley's, after she died, the battered women's charity shelter thing was.
the only thing that was there when I was a kid was the big part of the courthouse.
So this whole street opposite the back alley of
Was-
Miss Bryant's was all attorneys.
And Dr. Protho was there.
And Dr. Protho was the doctor they always called when you got sick,
Yeah.
when you fainted. You fainted all of the time when you were little, and later, until you got married.
And then there were 4 little houses right here. You can see remnants of them still. And that's where there were doctors and lawyers up and down there.
Yeah.
I think there were 5 little houses total.
So all of this crime and abuse happened in the back alley of the courthouse, and sandwiched between that and the rooming house for the railroaders.
This is where Tommy Willingham lived, and Ruth lived in a little house behind it, and so did Gracie Bell. And turn right here.
Okay, so now we're on 6th and Mitchell.
Yeah, and this, if I can find this house, Ruth had a real fancy bedroom set up. She took me in there one time, and she had a box of candy and a real fancy bedspread and all this stuff. And she
It was like an old shack like that, right? Like one of those little garage apartment things.
Well, yeah, it was. But I think, let's see, where? Oh, okay, yeah, that's where it had to be, because the button shop was right here.
Okay, so let me go back.
Because we're right on Conley.
Okay, so I'm gonna make a U-turn here on my 6th and Conley.
This is Conley. This is 6th and Conley.
Okay, so we're gonna make a U-turn here. And so her.
There was a teeny little stucco house here, and the lady who sold crochet and buttons, she was the button lady. I got to go over there and buy buttons one
house
had
right
that
here?
And it was just one bedroom at that time. It looks like they built on
Because it was a garage, so it obviously had a window and a door.
Yeah, and she had a bed in there and a dresser, and she had a box of Whitman's chocolates.
And that's why you lived at Bryant's. And I know I've asked you since if you thought she was a prostitute working for Bryant's, and she.
Delbert told me, Daryl Campbell told me she was a prostitute. I
Yeah.
argued with him about that. And this is part of the hospital I told you about. There were always nurses, and that was the front of it there.
Okay.
This little tiny
So this was the hospital, and then the blue building in the front was also the hospital.
And then it turned into doctor's offices when we were in high school.
Okay. So then,
And see, we would walk just down there.
yeah.
There's Main Street, then we'd walk that way. To
Yeah, the State
right
Theater is right there where the
Big,
red and blue striped tower is. And then right here,
Lyceum
a
was
block to
close.
this side, that's the courthouse. And then Mrs. Bryant's was just past that traffic light to the left. So
Yeah.
this all just happened within just a very small radius.
and lawyers everywhere.
And lawyers everywhere. of
And
course.
railroaders everywhere.
And a preacher for 5 little boys.
Yeah.
The church, the judicial system, and the railroad. Okay, so now we're gonna go.
See, there's the State Theater right there.
Yeah,
For the Lyceum.
it's the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to go to Dollar Night here on Tuesdays when I was in school. And this is where a girl I went to school with worked there and stole all their movie posters out of the attic.
Okay, and then there's a small building right down on this one. That was another theater for the Lyceum.
Oh yeah, and that was gone all the time. Okay, so I'm gonna go down here. So now we're turning on 4th and Main Street. We're turning back east. Let's see. So we're going this way. So this is the Citizens Bank right there. We used to always want a house that looked like that building. And then Ockett's or Williams Paint Store was right there. Something else now. We're turning right on 5th.
Their address is 119.
There's the post office and district attorney. Yeah.
That was
Oh, the little garage back there.
that guy was a Brett Railroad.
Are they the ones that had the turquoise?
No,
Oh, okay.
no, they
I
were.
thought they were the other part of town.
He carried diamonds. He was
There
from.
were a lot of little garage businesses.
He was
back
from
then.
Winoka. Leonard Mayhew.
And then there's Clovis Floral. We let that go to hell after 3 generations. And then, I'm gonna go up here because I'm gonna go down Wall Street if I can. I think the street's covered. was
he also was.
that was the goal because they had a retirement plan.
Yeah.
So they were after money.
Chasing.
So this is the street Ruth lived on. And she was good with flowers. She had a lot of landscaping and stuff when she lived in this house. But this is Ruth's house. And this house had 3 ginormous crystal leaded glass chandeliers that went from the front to the back, and they hung so low you had to duck your head to walk under them.
Yep.
Really, you had to walk around them because nobody could duck that little. But if you were like 3 years old, you could lay under them, and they were real cool.
Somebody opened the gate since we were here.
You may live there. I don't know. And then there was a story about that house back.
And that was Bill's.
I'm gonna make a U-turn.
Oh, Bill. That was.
Hang on, I'm gonna make a U-turn. It's in the house. This house is still really well cared for. They always had the cutest topiary trees all around it. When I was little, I'd sit on Ruth's porch and I thought they were ballerinas. Okay, so then this house up here.
This used to belong to Bill Alcott. That was one of his ranch houses, one of the first ones he ever bought. He was always trying to get me to move into it, and I wouldn't do it. But when we were kids, after Melzine and Ray Tipton divorced, Ray married a woman that had 4 tiny little girls, and he finally took them to Amarillo. He was terrible. Oh, and his sister was a prostitute for Mrs. Bryant, and
Bill Alcott's sister?
No, Ray
Tipton's
Tipton's
sister. Okay.
I can't remember her name. One of his sisters was Ann Eubanks, and I don't remember that girl's name right now. But anyway, she left Miss Bryant's. She was a prostitute there, and she left Miss Bryant's and went to Las Vegas. And while I was there, a box came back to us, to Mrs. Bryant, because that was her last known address, and that was her personal address because she got killed. And
she was trying to get out of the abuse of this place,
and she
wound
went
up
there, and what a mess.
I'm going to go back around that block because I interrupted you.
Oh, and the other person who was a child prostitute at Mrs. Bryant's was May Turntime, and she was Steve Wilma's mother-in-law, and he was married to one of her twins, and she came to the house. She was 12 years old when she ran away and got married, and her husband was a Coca-Cola delivery person. Really nice people, and she worked for Jameson's grocery store, and she asked me one time, she came to Mrs. Bryant's while I was there and brought the girls to see Miss Bryant once. And Mrs. Bryant said, oh, when you come back next time, she said, I will never be back here again. You've seen them, we're done. And she left. And when I was a teenager, I would go in that store all the time, and she'd ask me about Miss Bryant. Was she nice to me? And, oh, yeah, I was brainwashed into saying that she was super nice and there was never any problems. And she said, I'm so glad to hear that, because she said she certainly was not nice to me. And she got married at age 12 and left there. And I literally had to get married to get away from Ruth too. And Rusty really did not want to marry me. He was only marrying me for money, and he was furious when he didn't get on the bank account immediately. But Ruth threatened me if I ever mentioned it, and I had already mentioned it to his brother, so they knew about it, because I was working at the barn.
What did you say to Delbert? Delbert was Rusty's brother.
Ruth waited till 20 minutes before a cattle sale started, and she knew I ran a window, and she knew I would barely have time to drive to the house, sign papers, and leave. And so I did that. And when I got there, she told me it was going to be papers for my car, that it was an insurance person. When I walked in, he introduced himself. He was some kind of a representative, and he brought these papers that looked like, to me, like a house abstract. It was real thick, and he handed it to me and said, Bonnie, you were left a lot of money, and you have to get somebody to manage it because it's too much money for you to handle. And so and it had to be a manager. I had to get a manager to manage it. And
How old were you?
I was 20.
So you had worked for.
I worked for Williams from the time I was 16 when I graduated from high school to, let's see, I was just about 19. I worked for the barn about a year and a half or two before I left and went to Belton where Rusty was. And
You were telling me about you went to October.
when I went to sign the papers, when that guy told me that, Ruth jumped up and said, let me manage it, I'll manage it. You want me to manage it, don't you? And I said, absolutely not. All the time I worked for Williams, she would come every Friday when I got paid with a list of things she needed me to buy, like a silk dress from the fashion store, shoes to match from Jackman's, and whatever she wanted. Magnalite cookware, Fiesta.
So she's had your paycheck spent every
She had
week.
my paycheck spent, except that I took her and I always had a date on Friday, and Saturday I took her and Dee Dee and Tommy to the movies. So I'd have money for that. On Sunday, every other Sunday, I paid for Sunday dinner for the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
And Leonard alternated with me, and he paid the other Sunday. And so my money just went. And so finally, some way I saved $400. And Bill asked me one day, he said, Bonnie, why don't you get a car? Because I was like 18 or 19. And I said, I have a car. And he said, you have a car? And I said, yeah. He said, how did you get it? I said, I bought it. He said, did you make payments? I said, no, I saved the money. And Ruth brought her brother over there, and he had this.
And that was Ralph?
Yeah, fancy little 54 Chevy with like a candy apple blue, really pretty and in mint condition. And he needed $450, which I had in the bank. And she called me home and said, I want you to give him that money because you're buying his car. And she said, and you're not going to drive it. And I was 19, and she said, Leonard's going to drive it to and from work, and you're going to pay the registration on it, and you're going to pay for it, and you are not going to drive it. I'm going to take you to. She took me to and from work and came and got me at noon. I almost never was alone. Rusty left one time, left the house mad, went storming out the door in Belton, and I just lost it. I just was having a fit, and I guess the neighbors heard me, because when I got back, he said, have you never been alone? And I hadn't.
Yeah.
There was always somebody with me. And I'd go drag Maine, and she'd go with me.
Yeah.
I couldn't do anything alone.
So how did that come up with Delbert then?
Oh, well, it was 20 minutes before the sale started, and I ran a sales window, and I was the only one in the office that could run a calculator fast enough to keep up with the auctioneer. And so I couldn't find him when I left, when Ruth told me I had to come home and sign those papers. And so when I went back, he was furious because he was just panicked, because I had to figure all the yardage and everything for the cattle and hand it to him, and he wrote a check, and the cattle,
The live auction.
yeah, and the ranchers would be there lined up wanting their check right then. I mean, I had to stay up with the auctioneer, and he had to write checks for them, and he was just livid. He was
So when did
so
you that was when you had to sign the papers for the insurance
for the bail?
stuff?
No, she told me it was insurance. It was the Bell estate.
Okay. I thought you were at Williams when that happened.
No, I was at Williams when I was 18. I had to be 20 when I signed that paper for the Bell estate. When I was 18, she called me home and told me to come in the back gate. And I think she was trying to keep Leonard from knowing. And Cliff's dad, Cliff Robertson is my dad, and his father was also Cliff Robertson. My dad was Clifford Parker Robertson III, and he was Cliff Robertson, the grandfather, and he had his wife was 22 when she died, and she was Clifford, my dad, was 9 months old when she died, and she had moved to La Jolla and moved in with her mother, who was a nurse, like when she first got pregnant. And when she first got pregnant, she got a disease that was caused from taking a blow in the stomach when you're pregnant. And I read this in history, so I know this is true. And then she died at 22, so that left my grandfather a widow. And I found a place where he had been arrested for punching a lady in the stomach, and he might have been drunk, but I think she might have trapped him into a marriage that way. I don't know, but that's what I have from that. And when she died, he remarried a lady that had 2 children from another marriage, a boy and a girl. And Ruth called me home and told me to come in the back gate and sit down on the picnic table. She would meet me out there. And so she did. And instead of me coming through the house like normal, and she said that this lady had left me a lot of money. Well, in Texas, half of your estate goes to your wife, and they don't, I mean, that's hers, and that's what was going on. Well, I didn't know these people. She had threatened me if I ever remembered them the day at the house at Miss Bryant's when I was sitting on the porch. If I ever remembered them, spoke their name, because I was threatening to go to my grandmother's house and tell on them. And
so is she the one that you remember living in a big white house when you were little?
Yeah,
that's the big white house you mistook the railroader house, rooming house for. That
it
was across
white
from
at that
Bryant's.
time, and she lived in Twin Oaks. That was one of her houses. She also had the Walcott Mansion in the Hamptons, where my father died, and he had no connection with that family other than Grace, and they were not married. And I'm sure that was part of my estate, because I was the sole heir to Thalia's money, and she died in her 50s.
And who is Thalia?
She's my grandmother.
Okay.
She's Gracie. She's Gracie's mom.
Okay.
And she had 2 sisters, and Gracie Bell, she was a Massey when this happened, because she had been married, and she was a Fortescue before that. And my grandmother, her mother, my great-grandmother, was Gracie Bell Fortescue, and she had the Twin Oaks, she had the Walcott Mansion, she had a house in Palm Beach in Florida, and she had a brownstone in New York. And the brownstone I remember seeing my grandmother at, and she taught me how to shade in a nose. She was an artist.
How old were you?
I was 2. I was probably barely 2, 18 months or 2. When I was 14 months old, I remember an incident, and when I remember that incident, and anyway,
what do you remember at 14 months?
I remember taking a bus from somewhere and winding up at Ruth's mother and dad's house out between Portales and Clovis.
Okay.
And the bus stopped out there and let us off.
Yeah.
And Gracie came flying out and grabbed me and did circles with me. And
Yeah.
I asked Ruth one time how old I was, and she said I was 14 months old, and I remembered that.
Yeah.
And they also the guys, Elvin and Melvin, went out and caught a bull snake and brought it to me to show me their pet.
Yeah.
And
how old were they?
Oh, I don't know. They were 12 or 13 probably.
Yeah.
14 maybe. I don't know. No,
Yeah.
they had to be 12 because Melzine, they were triplets. Melzine, Elvin, and Melvin. And Melzine was 14 when she married Ray.
Yeah.
Tipton.
I sure say they got married, a lot of them, when they were about 12
Yeah,
or
they
13.
were trying to put them into prostitution. And so they just
got
got married.
married to get out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
There were
Elmo's
there were
12.
how many kids in that family that survived?
13 that survived.
Yeah.
13 that survived.
So they were dirt poor.
Yeah.
I mean, they literally lived in a house with a dirt floor at times.
Yeah, they did.
Shared one bed.
But
Yeah.
the money that came from, I went and sat down in the picnic table, and she told me that this woman that I didn't know just gave me a bunch of money, and I said,
Who else was there?
Just being her. She was
Not
trying
the
to keep
insurance
anybody.
guy?
No,
Okay.
this was the first one when I was 18.
Okay.
This was from the Robertsons. This was that half of that
Oh.
ranch that was.
So that's
two-
when you came home from Williams when
Yeah.
you were 18. Okay.
This, and I came home from the barn. I was always working. Came
So-
home from the barn when I signed the other one.
Okay, so that one.
But anyway, what happened on that one, just so you know the rest of the story,
Yeah.
I sat down at the picnic table and she said this woman had a lot of money and she gave it to me. And I said, and so who is she? And she said, it's nobody you need to know about. She's not, I said, and she's not related to me? And she said, no, she's not related to you at all. She just wanted to give you money. And she said, you have to go to the court and tell them that you want it because her son is fighting you for it. He's going to court to take it away from you. And that would have been the stepson of my grandfather.
Mhm.
And I said, and he is her son? And she said, yes. And I said, then I'm not doing it. I said, he has more right to that money than I do if I don't have it, if she's not a relative. I found out many years later that she was my step-grandmother. But anyway, I refused to do it, and she got mad and told me to go back to work. So I went and walked. She made me walk home, and I walked back to work because she didn't want Leonard. Leonard was asleep in the house. He worked nights, and she didn't want him to know about that money. She was going to just scarf it.
And that was when you were working at the paint store,
Uh-huh.
Williams Paint Store.
Yeah, and that would have been half of that estate, and that estate was 50 miles by 200. The ranch in its original form, because it was a land grant from the government to Clack, who is a grandfather 5 times removed, and he had been an officer he was a Confederate officer in the war, and they gave him that ranch to bring 250 pioneers to Temple, Texas, or actually it was the stagecoach stop at Salado, and they did do this. They homesteaded. You could homestead, get some land, and so that they formed a little community there, and he protected them from the Indians and from all the problems that would go on, and he was over them. And then later on, he ran for an office, and he worked with Sam Houston in San Antonio.
And so that was probably when Sam Houston was president
Yeah.
of Texas.
Yeah, or
And-
governor. I don't know. if it was his.
and-
If it was it was.
Clack's house is
territory.
still near Salado.
Yeah.
And you
he-
found that you online?
Yeah. It's
okay.
it's very well documented.
Yeah.
And there's a library there that's donated to him, a museum, and we haven't ever gone through it, but I'd like to do that sometime. But he, I was going to tell you something else about him. He's really historical.
So then, okay, so that's the inheritance when you were 18.
That's what I was going to tell you. He donated half a section of land so that they could build a little village at the stagecoach, which is now Salado, and so they would have a little town there.
Okay, yeah. And we've spent a lot of time in
Mm-hmm.
Salado. Okay, so that was the inheritance when you were 18, when she had you walk from Williams through the back
Yeah,
gate.
it was half of that ranch. I was a sole
And
heir
then
to
what
that.
happened with that?
I don't know.
You didn't sign any more paperwork?
I
You
didn't sign. I refused.
Okay.
I didn't do anything. I said, if it's, if he's her son.
So do you think she forged anything on it?
No, I don't think she could. I don't think she could at all. Because that was when they took me to the courthouse and forced me to sign papers that they could adopt me. So they might have tried something.
That's when
with
they
it.
adopted you, because
At
you were
18.
18 and a half years old when they adopted
Yeah.
you.
Mhm. That was when
Yeah.
that happened. And
And then they sealed your birth records also.
Oh, yeah.
And then the state of Arkansas, we tried to get them for years and they were sealed. we could only get them if Ruth would sign off on it or if she died.
they
And
were
she refused to
totally-
sign off on it. And then when she, well, the original ones we never got.
Mhm.
And then when she finally died, we tried to get them again, and the state sent a letter back to you that said the courthouse and all the records had burned, but they would testify to the fact that you were a natural-born American citizen, so you could get a passport,
Yeah.
and you were able to get a passport.
Yeah. And
And the lady Myra Broaddus was the lady we talked to all those years, who was in the vital statistics office in Arkansas, and she alluded many times to corruption with children and adoption records, but she never expanded on it. I tried to friend her on Facebook for years. She won't respond to anything. So
I had a session and remembered this house that Cliff's dad and stepmother were staying at for the winter, the Texas winter. They had a house up there, and I called a genealogist in Mena and described that house to her because I left $13 there, and I
that was when we were in Stillwater,
Yeah.
because you
had a
were
flash-
having flashbacks.
and
And when we went in that house, it was the exact description, the
Mhm.
exact dolls that were in your flashback.
I called that genealogist, and she said, "Bonnie, I know exactly where that house is. It's a tea room." And she said, "It's open every day." I said, "Do you think I could go through it?" And she said, "I'm absolutely sure they would let you go through it."
And we drove there, and they
and
did.
we drove there,
Yeah.
and I asked them if they knew anything about when I lived there, and they said, "Oh no, that's years ago, 1945." But they said if
They
you
were
go
a young
next
couple
door-
from somewhere else. They
Yeah, they were
they just
Spanish.
kind of come in and
but
bait a restaurant.
they
Yeah.
told me the ladies, there were two old ladies next door, and they had lived there at that time, and they would probably know.
Yeah.
And we went over and talked to them, and they said, "You have to be the little Robertson girl." And I said, "Robertson? People say that all the time, and I don't know who the Robertsons are." And
Yeah.
they said, "Well, you're that little girl." And I still didn't believe it. But anyway,
Yeah.
Ruth wouldn't let me take my dolls. In what she did, how she got a hold of me, I was playing with her son, Arnold. I would go over to their house and play. It wasn't too far from where my grandparents were staying. And they'd let me go play. And Ruth would spank me every time I was over there. She'd grab a switch and beat me up. And for some, she'd concoct something that I did. And one day I went over there, and she did that a lot. And one day I went over there, and she took my shoes off. There was a sandy road, and she told me that I was going to walk to the judge's office with her. And I said, "What's a judge?" And she explained. And she said, "You're going to tell them that I am your mother and that you want to live with me." And she said, "If you don't do that, I am going to beat you all the way home." And she rolled up a leather belt and put it in her purse.
Mhm.
And she took my shoes off and made me walk in the hot sand. And it was far enough that my feet were blistering. And I did what she told me to. And because the laws said if a mother wants to keep the children, nobody's going to get them, not even the father.
Yeah. Back
And that's
then.
how she got me. She used to
Yeah.
laugh all the time about doing that, but I didn't know what she meant back then.
Right.
But anyway, I figured it out later. But the dolls were still there. And I went down and asked the man that owned that house then and had the tea room. I said, "Do you know anything about the dolls upstairs?" And he said, "Yes. They were attached to the abstract on the house in 1945, and it says they cannot ever be removed."
I remember that.
She said they're still there.
Yeah. I
And
remember that.
they were beautiful silk dresses, and they
Mhm.
no longer had them. The kids had played with them. They'd marked all over them. Their wigs were a mess, but they were still there because of that abstract. And then while I told Ruth about that, and she about panicked when she figured out I was really remembering things. And Bill Ockett came through there about, I don't know, a few months later.
That was when he came to
Yeah.
Stillwater when we
And
lived
he
there.
took me out to dinner, and he drove around Stillwater, and I didn't know where the airport was. And he said, "Well, I'm convinced that you don't know where the airport is, so I'm not worried," because he thought that Cliff had flown in there, I'm sure.
Mhm.
And he said, "I'm going to Arkansas to buy land." I said, "Why would you buy land in Arkansas?" It didn't make any sense, but it does now. I mean, he bought that house so he could destroy the evidence.
So, So then back to when you told Delbert about.
Well, that was what I was telling you about at the picnic table in the backyard was the Robertson Ranch. That was a land grant. It was
Okay.
half of that
Yeah.
estate.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that went back to my grandfather. I don't know what happened to it. But I do know that while I was married to Rusty, that he called me from work. This was just about a year before the divorce, and he told me that I better not go to the mailbox. And then he called me back later and said, BR, if you go to the mailbox, I'm going to see your feet in the snow.
Mm-hmm.
So you better not do it. Well, before that, when I signed when I left the barn, like when I was 20, I went to or I might have been 21. I guess I was 21 because that's when I would have gotten that. But, I told you about signing the papers and Ruth wanting to be the manager, and I said, absolutely not. And so...
She was illiterate.
Yeah.
And she couldn't do math at all. I mean, not even when I was in high school. She could write a little bit, but she struggled. Yeah.
But she just wanted the money.
Yeah.
And Leonard was there, and when I signed it, I said, you know what? I kind of caught myself when I put Bill's name down as manager, and I said, you know what? I think I better go have a lawyer look at this before I turn it in. And he snatched that paper out of my hands and said, you get yourself back to work. I'm taking care of this. That's the end of that. That's all I ever saw of it.
That's all you ever knew of it.
And then...
And you were 20 years old?
I was 21.
21.
And I kept calling because I married Rusty when I was 22. That was in April. I turned 22 in June, and I married him in December.
Yeah.
And...
of the same year. So
the
that
same year.
64.
Yeah. When they found out about the money, man, they were...
So what did Delbert say when you told him about that?
Well, he said, oh, huh. Well, how much was it? I said, I don't know. I said, I didn't get to see. And he said, then the next day he asked me, I came home that night, and Ruth said, I asked her, I said, so what about the money? How much was it? And she said, don't you ever, you know how that mean voice she has, don't you ever mention that again. Don't you ever ask me about it again. You are never getting it.
She had the voice of Satan when she was going to threaten somebody. Yeah.
She said, you better not ever tell anybody about it. I said, I already told Deborah. She said, why? I said, because he's my boss, and he asked me where I went, and I only had 20 minutes to get back there. But anyway, he knew about it, and he asked me when I went to work the next day, he said, so what about the money? And I said, they told me I'm not going to get it. He said, Bonnie, that is yours. It's yours to keep. And I said, well... Is
that when, because you said at some point Delbert was trying to get you to marry him or go out with him instead of, is that when?
He and Nawita
is that the same time?
Yeah.
Because he was married to Nawita.
Nawita left him for the accountant that she worked for.
But was he married to her at that time?
I think he might have been. Maybe not. No, they had to get a divorce before that. Maybe just 2 or 3 months after I went to work there. I don't know exactly when the time frame was, but Nawita came back here and called me, said, let's go get a Coke. And I went with her. She said, you should not be involved with that family. You certainly should not marry into it. And just really, I mean, she really lambasted them. And she wouldn't tell me why. And she said, well, if you're going to marry anybody, then Rusty would be the one to marry, but you shouldn't do any, you shouldn't get in there with them at all. And they had been involved with Billy Celestis. Yeah. And so they had
his reputation. Okay, I'm going to go back down the street because I want to ask you, we're back on Ross Street, and I'm going up from the 4th and Ross. Ruth lived at 508 Ross. So this is the block. So
this house on the corner, a bank officer lived there.
That's
Can't think of her name right
that's
now.
this house here.
Yeah, that's down from Ruth.
Did you ever lived in that house? Because they probably still own it.
I can't remember.
It was always well cared for.
Yeah, it was okay. But her husband was a quadriplegic, and he was
the bank. Okay.
Yeah,
that's right at 500. Okay, what I want to ask you is down here. So is it the blue house?
That's where Dick Ursula lives. I used to babysit there.
Okay, and then is it the next house where the lady hung herself?
In this house.
Oh, okay.
This,
So that is the yellow house. Where, hang on, let me back there.
when Bill Ockett owned this, his sister got a divorce, and she had a daughter. She had a son too, I think, but the son was maybe already gone.
And this
But
is
the daughter-
509 Ross.
Yeah, the daughter was about probably 12, and the mom came home one day, and the daughter had hung herself.
Yeah.
And then when
12 years old again.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then when we were back here after the divorce, and I was working at the auto parts store, someone called me and said, "Bonnie, you've got to tell Bill that his sister has died," and that was her mom.
That was her. Did she still live at that house at that time?
I don't know where she lives. She might have.
Who lived in this house next door to Rainbow North when you were there?
That was
This little flat top house.
her name. Oh, that house.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a red house, and when Gerald used to hang out over there all the time and work on his car, there was a guy there that he was a pilot,
Mm-hmm.
and he was from Oklahoma, and his wife was Jeanette, and I dated one of his brothers one time, and he was from Oklahoma, and he's coming for the weekend. She said, "Would you go out with him?" And I said, "Sure." So I did, and he was Billy. I can't think of his last name. I can't even think of their last name, but that guy was up in a plane with 3 other people, and they crashed it in the ice. And brother was Ruth's brother at that time was driving an ambulance, and he went and picked him up, and he described in detail about that. He was just mortified about
Traumatized, I guess,
Yeah.
is a better.
and he picked him up in body bags. And they were friends of Daryl Campbell's, and they all hung out together, worked on their cars, and went to the races. And her name was Jeanette, that his wife, but I think his name was Jerry, but I don't remember the last name. And then on the other side, Jack Joel married one of the sons of the Red Ribbon Farmers. Can't think of her name right now.
That was to the south of Ruth.
Yeah.
Ranchers and Farmers, the steakhouse or the other cattle auction barn? Okay.
The one that my grandfather went to and told me I should go there and do a good job, and I told him he should bring his cattle to the Four Seasons. And I asked him why. They asked me why. He said he has them shipped by Brady. And I said, yeah. They said, but why?
We just passed Murphy's grocery store. They had the liquor store next to it. That is where Ruth used to go buy groceries so she could slip in and get liquor.
They never knew what she was doing. You picked up
Some
on
people
stuff.
might dispute that, but she used to give us, when I was 3 years old, she used to give us whiskey sours told us we had a cough so we'd go to bed.
I would absolutely have killed her. I bet she told you never to tell me that. Oh,
Lemon,
anyway.
a load of lemon juice and a load of sugar and whiskey
Mm,
and a highball.
what a jackass.